My name's Lyzi, and I'm going to talk about tests for content. I work at a company called Mapbox. We build tools for developers and other designers to add maps to web and mobile applications, and we do so mostly via our APIs. If there's folks in the room who are kind of unfamiliar about the concept of an API, do not worry. It is not a prerequisite for this talk. But it is the topic, but not really. It's fine, you'll see. So the main point of this talk is that testing is good. Tests are good. We've heard that in like all the talks that we've heard today. But the other point of the talk is that testing is necessary. And whether or not you're testing in a formal way or an informal way, you are doing tests on your documentation as you write it. And sometimes they just happen in your head. You have a set of standards in your head, and you're testing against those standards. So I'm going to talk about testing in the context of our API documentation at Mapbox and how we ended up building it. I am going to talk about sort of the general reasons our approach was successful, and then last we'll talk about how you can do it too. So part one, the Mapbox API documentation story. I'm going to take you back to September 5th, 2015, and I'm going to do so with the aid of the Wayback Machine. We can give a round of applause for the Internet Archive. Would not have been possible. So this was the Mapbox API documentation when I was using it to do support. And there are some problems with it. First of all, over here in the left column, we see the gray headers. I know it's a little difficult to see, but the gray headers are the names of APIs, and then the blue headers are the subsections within that API's documentation. You'll notice the Maps API has a subhead called Map IDs, another one called Tiles, another one called Image Quality and Retina, but then the Static Maps API has images and image quality and retina, and size limit. And then geocoding just goes completely off the rails into a totally different direction, which is fine. Again, we have different products, different tools. But you'll notice over here that we have a tool called the Surface API and the Distance API. What is missing from the other headers? Right? There's inconsistency in terms of the structure of the documentation. This API at the time was already deprecated, but still in our documentation. And all the pages looked slightly different. So that was annoying. And so looking at this at the time and trying to use it and getting really frustrated and then feeling like I wasn't capable of doing anything about it and then getting frustrated again and hammering on coworkers to say, we need to actually fix this and make this better for users, got me thinking about what makes good documentation and why this documentation was so difficult to use. And the things that I came up with, I regurgitated them in my brain when I was putting these slides together, and they all just happened to start with C. It wasn't on purpose, although that last one is a made-up word. Consistency. You want your documentation to be consistent so that a user has a good experience using it. You want it to be complete. You don't want anything to be missing. You want it to be correct, and you want it to be contributable. We're just going to pretend it's a real word, as in it's easy to contribute to. So this, which was a little bit of a hot mess, is now this, which is cut off a little bit on the side there, but it's a 3-column format with table of contents on the one side, your content in the middle. It's a single page, so you can search on it, and then examples on the right side that are available in different languages. And for every API in here, we have the same basic structure of the documentation. You have the name of a method and the example that corresponds with that method. And as you click on, again, kind of hard to see, but as you click on something in the sidebar, it scrolls down to that part of the page, and it'll show you the different methods that are underneath that particular API. So we went from something that was incomplete, inconsistent, not super correct, to something that has a bunch of different contributors working together to make documentation that meets those 4 C's. And we had some really awesome tools at our disposal. We built some great things in order to make that happen. So I'm going to talk about them. The 2 main tools I'm going to talk about are called docbox and retext-mapbox standard. And I'm just going to talk about them one by one. Really important, special thanks to my former coworker, Tom McWright, and this dude, Titus, who I've never met, but contributes code on the internet, for contributing to awesome open source projects. The fact that I don't even know this person's last name and he has like completely changed my work life is one of the cool things about open source. So I just wanted to make sure that this shout out to them got in here. So docbox. Docbox is the generic open source version of our API documentation. It takes Markdown files, which is a markup language, or it compiles to markup language, makes it a little easier to write code that is HTML-like without having to fuss with angle brackets. Typically, you write Markdown so it can be compiled into HTML and be shown on a web page. In this case, we used Markdown for a slightly different purpose. So the source files for all of the documentation in docbox are written in Markdown, and they automagically, that word comes up a few times, they automagically are turned into this beautiful documentation. And the way that works is that we use a tool called remark, also made by Worm, that takes this Markdown and turns it into some structured data. And again, if you're unfamiliar with these concepts, don't worry, I drew it out a little bit. But the idea is that Markdown data is relatively unstructured, meaning it's hard to get computers to do things automatically with it. JSON is JavaScript object notation, which means that it's easier for computers to take it and do things with it. So in short, remark, this tool, takes Markdown, and instead of turning it into HTML, turns it into these JSON objects. And that makes it a lot easier to do cool stuff with them. Load. I thought I loaded all these images beforehand, but you know. So as this slowly loads, totally on purpose, you can see that this is a handwritten Markdown file for my magical rainbow API. This is what a Markdown file for in docbox might look like. So you start off by giving it a header. The octothorpes, the hashes in there, are Markdown syntax for headers. It has some descriptions. We have an endpoint that lists all the rainbows, and then we have some examples that show what you get and what you send and what you get from this API endpoint. So what docbox does is it takes this Markdown file and turns it into an object which has these distinct components. So every time there's a different type of text, it grabs a different component, or makes a different component in this JSON object. So now each of these are individual pieces, which means that you can move them around on the page. And so that Markdown file turns into something that looks like docbox. And it does so by going through that object and saying, okay, if it's an H2, put it on the left side in the table of contents. If it's an H3, put it in the middle. If it's an H4, put it on the side. This is so cool. This is like web design for people like me who are terrible at web design, because I don't have to think about how this is going to be structured. All I have to think about is writing my documentation the way that I like to write it in Markdown, and then throwing it at this program that is going to make a beautiful site from it. So docbox is also super cool because it has tests for structure. So before you fall asleep from looking at a wall of code, you can see here in the middle, the nice thing about these tests is that they kind of say what they're doing. So this test makes sure that in every Markdown has an H2 title. Make sure that it has an API description. It makes sure that all of the examples are valid. And it's running through and automatically checking all of these things. And that's built right into the right into the tool. The other tool that we used in conjunction with docbox is called retext-mapbox standard. And the idea here is that it's a library that you can run when you build the documentation site that checks language. And it tests, in our case, this is a specific one to Mapbox. That second bullet point here, Mapbox, used to be Mapbox with a capital B. Now we are Mapbox with a lowercase b, which is super annoying. Because if you muscle memory or you're auto-correcting or users, you never really know what you're going to get. So a tool like this makes sure that every time the word Mapbox appears in the documentation, it has a lowercase b. And if it doesn't have a lowercase b, then it'll throw an error and it won't let you keep going, which is pretty cool. So retext-mapbox standard takes advantage of retext, which, again, another project by my lovely internet friend who I've never met, Worm, that provides a kind of planting ground for a bunch of different plugins. And these are not a full list of plugins, but these are just some of them that check different parts of language. So if your documentation suffers from profanity, you may have some other problems, but you can use retext profanities, which will add an automated test for profane writing, which is pretty awesome. And so all of these are just available to you. You don't have to go and do the search for the list of the words that you don't want. It's already here. You can throw it right into your test, and it'll automatically go through and check those. So what we did, Mapbox, or retext-mapbox standard, is another one of these plugins that just is specific to Mapbox. And in retext-mapbox standard, we have 3 different types of words, phrases that we added. So we added a list of acronyms that are acceptable. These are the only acronyms that are acceptable. All other acronyms will throw an error. And these are just ones that are commonly used in our documentation. Brand. At Mapbox, we use a tool called OpenStreetMap. People love to abbreviate it as OSM when you type it over and over and over again. So this test checks to make sure that there's no instances of open OSM or open space street space map or OpenStreetMaps, which is another one that people love. It makes sure that TIFF has two Fs, because that's how we've chosen to identify TIFFs. And then we have a list of forbidden words. These are the forbidden words, right? Easy, simple, obviously. The one that is underneath the O in forbidden is sexy. I also agree that you probably shouldn't use that in your documentation. So when the tests run, they test for all of the things that are considered in here, plus the things that are built into retext. So and I also want to do another shout out to my colleague Katie Decora. She has written some excellent presentations and work, and she compiled a lot of those lists and curated them. So I'm going to shout out to Katie. So this is what it looks like in action. So in this scenario, I opted out of a live demo and did a GIF instead. The static API is missing a JavaScript example. One of the rules that we have in our documentation is that every method has to have an example for every language that we provide. If it's not supported, you leave a comment that says it's not supported, but it still has to be there. So here, I'm going to run the test. So this is what it looks like when you run the test. It starts to go through file by file and tests everything that you have told it to test, and then it throws an error. So you see here, it's throwing an error because it says, retrieve a static map from a style. This test failed. It does not have a JavaScript example. And it's kind of awesome if you think about that, like, if you're working on documentation that has 100 different possible methods and one of them is broken, you don't have to manually look through each one and figure out what's broken. It's going to tell you what's broken. So in our case, the solution would be to add a comment that says, this API cannot be accessed with the JavaScript SDK, which looks like this in Markdown. See, it's a real JavaScript comment. And then this was what it looks like to run the test again with it passing. once we do that, which is exciting. I swear, this is like more than half my life is spent sitting waiting for tests to pass or not pass. And I love that we can share that knowledge with everybody, whether they program or not. You all can sit and wait for tests for a long time. So you can see here that like there are very specific tests in here, right? Like they are looking at, for every single type of example, looking for making sure the method name is valid, looking for anything that we want it to look for. So that is what we did. We implemented these two tools to make our API documentation, which was super cool because now it is complete and accurate and consistent. And so now I'm going to talk about sort of why that approach worked, because it touches my 3 C's and my 1 made-up C. So it enforces consistency, it ensures completeness, it pushes an eye towards correctness, doesn't do that automagically, but forces you to think about it, and it makes it easier for more people to contribute to the documentation. So the consistency enforcement is automagical. It forces consistency in content and in structure. So this is from the README. It says, if you make a method, you can only use these verbs, because people like to use different verbs for a GET request. GET, retrieve, request, and we wanted to make it consistent because that was inconsistent in our previous documentation. And it also forces consistency in the documentation, and on like a 3rd level, the APIs themselves, the tool itself. So this is, you don't have to read it. This is from the post we wrote internally when we finished the project about why this was exciting. The important part is in bold, where it says, the act of building documentation yielded conversations about how our APIs interact with each other, which is important when you're building a platform. The fact that we tried to create a structure around our APIs forced us to look at the places where they were inconsistent and where they were not working well together. Using automated content testing ensures completeness. Again, if you look at this code, it's making sure it has all the things that it needs. And if it doesn't, then it fails, as we saw before. And it encourages and enables collaboration in writing documentation, which is not automagical. So I went on to the repository that has our API documentation in it. Most projects we have about 5 contributors average on a project. So I started scrolling down and down. And this went all the way to 43. 43 different people at this company have touched and made commits to this documentation. Some of them work in support. Some of them work on other technical products. They're all over the map. They're able to come in and make changes to the documentation. And last but not least, it forces decision making, because you have to decide how you want your documentation to look, which surprisingly doesn't happen that often when you're writing documentation. There isn't always a sit down where you think about, okay, what is the structure that we want to have our documentation convey? And so with this process, you have to think about that. You have to think about what you want it to look like, so then you can write the test that automatically checks for your structure. And super special bonus unintended awesome thing is that more people are able to speak knowledgeably about the product and ask compelling questions. Because if more people contribute to your documentation from across your company, more people are going to be able to understand your product and understand the challenges around documentation. And using a system like this, which is familiar, has elements that are familiar to all different types of people who are using and writing documentation at your company, it allows someone like me, who at the time was on support, to say to somebody on our platform team, hey, I think, I don't know the technical details necessarily, but I think the way that you're approaching this is incorrect, because it doesn't conform to the way it's being approached in all of our other tools. And then I get to learn from that experience as well. So automation begets structure, which begets automation, which begets structure, which begets automation, and so on and so on. The more things that you add, the more structure you come up with, the more you can automate. All of this is customizable to your degree of customness. In truth, without automated testing, our documentation would fail, both practically, in terms of we would not be able to keep it consistent and complete, but also the project never would have happened in the first place, because it involved me yelling at people and taking a lot of time from engineers to say, we need to sit and build this, we need to sit and make this happen, and the only way they were going to get on board was if we added automation, and it's ended up really saving us. Just as an exercise, testing is everywhere. It's all over the software world. And so I did a search in the Mapbox organization for the word test, and this would just reveal repositories that have the word test in the name or in the description. There were 49. 49 libraries or 49 projects that are directly related to testing different things, because we do this all the time. And so here's some practical bits about how you can also add testing in your workflow. So it doesn't matter where you go, tests are going to follow you everywhere. It doesn't matter what system you're using for your documentation, what languages you're writing in, it doesn't matter. Tests will follow you wherever you go. Before we did our work on this project, we had an automated test that checked for some language, and it was called Mapbox content test. And it particularly looked for these two things on the bottom. It looked for links that were going to open in a new tab without a refer, and it looked for OSM, the acronym. And that's all it did. But that was the seed of it. And this awesome tool that Katie made called CopyCop, which relies on this amazing website, which I'm sure you are all aware of, but maybe not, and that's okay. But this is a US government website that tells you all of the words that might be too complex and their simpler friends. And this is just the A's, or the A's and the B's. But plainlanguage.gov, very good resource for this. And so CopyCop is a tool that uses this data set to identify words you should avoid, words you should omit, and words that can be swapped. So this is CopyCop. It's a very cool tool. It doesn't like the word easy, so it's going to tell me that I shouldn't use the word easy. It doesn't like the word crazy because it's ableist, and it wants me to switch the word forward to the word send and the word accordingly to the word so, which is a nice example of like document automation not always doing exactly what you want it to do. But that tool is very awesome. I'm sure if you've been to this conference before, you're familiar with the Hemingway app, which does a lot of similar work. You can put your content in, and it checks for word choice, it checks for passive voice, and it checks for complexity automatically. And these tools are both open source, which is great. You can go on and grab the code and implement it. Ultimately, your writers or designers or managers, you shouldn't spend more than half your time editing other people's work, especially if you're editing the same things over and over again. And automated content testing helps you to do that and not spend all your time editing. If you have other automated testing tools that I didn't mention from other languages or other websites, that's awesome. I would love to hear more about them. So if you could tweet them out with #WriteTheDocs, that would be great. And lastly, I like to include this slide in every talk I give. This stuff seems hard, and I know I threw some jargon at you. I'm sorry I did that. But you can do it if you want to, because you're a champion, and you can do anything you set your mind to, because this little tiny cactus believes in you. You can do the thing. So this presentation is online, lyzidiamond.com/content-testing-WTD. I'll tweet it out after I hop off here. I'm on Twitter, Lyzi Diamond, and on GitHub, and all the things is my username. And y'all are fantastic and wonderful, and thank you so much.